1944, World War II, the Normandy beaches. A bunch of Allied troops have just plunged underwater to stop being shot by German machine guns. Above the water's hell. Bullets tinkle on iron. Cameras all over the place. This scene was actually shot on a peaceful beach in Ireland. But director Steven Spielberg brought bullets and blood and bombs to that beach. A lie to tell the truth. This is filmmaking. The art of making us feel that we're there. A young woman in Paris has her eyes closed to feel the warmth of the sun on her face. At the same time, unseen by her, this little street drama takes place. White light floods the screen, links the young and old woman. We want to reach into the screen to help the old lady. This is filmmaking, cinema as an empathy machine. The Normandy beach scene and The French Lady show that, in its use of sound and light and truth, cinema can be great. The story of film is the story of that greatness. It's a story full of surprises. At first thought, you'd guess that the story of film will be about scenes like this one from Casablanca, full of yearning, story and stardom. Because Casablanca is a Hollywood classic, Ingrid Bergman's lit like a movie star, highlights in her eyes. It's all filmed on a studio set. But films like Casablanca are too romantic to be classical in the true sense. Instead, Japanese films like this are the real classical movies. Romantic films are always in a rush. But this moment in Record of a Tenement Gentleman is a pause in the story. A cat, a chiming clock, a kettle quietly coming to the boil, the almost square frame filled with smaller squares and rectangles, calm, emotionally restrained, like a little classical Greek temple. So Hollywood's not classical, Japan is. Before Edison, there'd been fun fairs, circuses, magic lantern shows, magicians' acts. Still images were reflected on mirrors or spun in a box. This happened not in fancy cities in the world, but places like this, Leeds in England. The American George Eastman came up with the idea of film on a roll. Edison and his colleague W.K.L. Dixon egged each other on to find that if you spin these images in a box, they give the illusion of movement. And then look at this, invented by Edison. It's called the Black Maria. Edison and many of the other manic ideasy inventors of cinema realized that beyond the equipment and machines, what you needed most for movies was light. It probably didn't occur to them that cinema would become the art of light. But somehow, in building this box on wheels that turned to follow the sun, whose roof opened by turning this wheel, Edison took the first steps in that direction. He had a hunch that cinema was a dark room where light mattered. He shot little movies here. This couple kissing, for example, a little moment that everyone could understand. But to see these films, you had to look inside something like this. That wasn't enough. It was too private and small. Cinema had to be bigger. And it became so. Here, in Lyon, in this house, in the minds of these passionate men, Louis Lumière and his brother Auguste. The brothers were as ideasy as Edison. Louis in particular was technically brilliant. He realised that the grab advance mechanism of a sewing machine would allow the strip of film to be advanced, paused, exposed, advanced, paused, exposed. This is one of the very first Lumière cameras. Open its back, shine a light through it, and it becomes a projector. Count Leo Tolstoy called the result the clicking machine, like a human hurricane. One of the first films the Lumière shot was this one. A short documentary of everyday life, their workers leaving a factory, the Lumière factory. This is the factory today, the place of the first movie, the source of the Nile. But it wasn't enough for the Lumières to make such home movies. They wanted to show them, not just in a box to one person at a time like Edison, but to groups. On the 20th of December 1895, in this building on the Boulevard Capucine in Paris, the Lumière brothers projected film. Light shone through it onto a screen bigger than life. It's hard for us today to picture how enchanting it was. This is one of the very first films that the Lumières shot and showed on the Boulevard Capucine. It's said to have unnerved the audience. They thought the train was coming at them. This is laughable today, but look at this. Light projected on a building in 21st century Lyon. The effect is startling. Digital imagery of a type we haven't seen before. The shock of the new, just like the Lumière train. Something that had already happened, light from a distant star, came back to life for the very first time. But almost at once it was seen as lowbrow for the working classes. Its jokes and jolts were unsophisticated and soon became boring. So from about 1898, the earliest filmmaker inventors turned their minds from the machinery of cinema to shots and cuts. Things started to get exciting. In Paris, for example, a theatre illusionist called Georges Méliès, who'd been at the Boulevard Capucine that first night, filmed on a street. Film's now lost, but here's what happened. His camera jammed, then started again. When he looked at the results, streetcars seemed to disappear, just like these people seemed to disappear. Cinema's first magic trick. In this scene, he used the same technique to make a man appear rather than a streetcar disappear. Innovation by accident, you could say, but it drove the medium forward. Where the Lumières were cinema's first documentarists, Méliès was its first special effects director. His film The Moon at 1 metre astonished people too. In Lyon today, in the Festival of Lights, a moon rises over the city as if in tribute to Méliès. Filmmakers usually kept their camera wide because they hadn't considered other options, or assuming that if they went close, it would confuse or disrupt the audience. But then G.A. Smith did this. He wanted to show us the cat eating in more detail. The cut between the wide and close not only worked, it seemed natural, and so close-ups were born. The films of some of the greatest directors are hard to imagine without them. In this incredible moment in Sergei Eisenstein's film October, the government raises a bridge to stop revolutionary workers storming a city, but it's the close-ups of a dead woman's hand and hair being pulled off the raising bridge that give the real sense of movement and tragedy. In Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, it's only when Charles Bronson looks in big close-up into the eyes of Henry Fonda that he realizes that Fonda is the murderer he's been searching for all his life. Back in America, Enoch J. Rector extended film in another way. He filmed a boxing match, not with the standard size of film, 35mm, but with a negative that was 63mm wide. The broader image showed more of the action. Widescreen cinema was born. It's the norm now, but would not become commercially so until 1953. Film had already come far. It was born as a sideshow, a novelty, quick fun, like fast food. But almost at once, it became clear that it was also a language. A new language, a language of ideas. But they still had to learn how to do this. Cut. Editing made cinema. To see how, look at the life of an American fireman made in 1903 by a Pennsylvanian dynamo of a man called Edwin Stanton Porter. A fireman arrives outside a blazing house to rescue a mother and her child. We see the street action first. Then the same action again from inside. Some years later, Porter recut the film. This time, after the fireman arrives, we cut inside the house to see the first rescue, then outside again to see her being brought down the ladder, then inside again to see him rescue the child, then back outside again. The audience follows the story of the rescue despite the fact that one space, the street, suddenly disappears from the screen and is magically replaced by another space, the room. This could never happen in theatre. The earlier version of the film, which you could call the theatrical version, doesn't fragment the space, but repeats the time like an action replay. The intercut version has a continuous timeline. We see everything in the order in which it was done, but the space is fragmented. Cinema was learning, experimenting, thinking even. It could now show the flow of action from one space to another. This made chase sequences possible. It liberated movies. It emphasized movement. Nearly every scene in the story of film will in some way use this most basic of storytelling devices, continuity cutting, the editing equivalent of the word then. This was a landmark. Theatrical cinema was giving way to action cinema. And Porter, he lost everything in the Wall Street crash of the 20s and died forgotten in 1941. It's easy to forget what a conceptual jump editing was, but 21 years after The Life of an American Fireman, the comic genius Buster Keaton shot a scene using double exposure, which reminds us. Keaton plays a film projectionist. He falls asleep, dreams of cinema, climbs into a film. And then, bam, a cut. The world around him is suddenly replaced by another world, instantly, magically. In 1907, cinematic innovation went up a gear. Look at The Horse That Bolted by the Frenchman Charles Pathé. A man leaves his horse on the street as he delivers food to an upstairs customer. The horse spies something to eat and tucks in. Cut to the man climbing the stairs. Then cut back to the horse, which isn't doing a new thing. It's still eating. Then back to the man just a second later. Then back to the horse. In The Life of an American Fireman, the cuts showed what happened next. Here, they're showing what's happening at the same time. This isn't continuity editing, it's parallel editing. It doesn't say then, it says meanwhile. Great filmmakers have used this meanwhile editing ever since to contrast events, build tension, or advance two storylines at once. And soon after continuity and parallel editing were invented, another remarkable editing technique was born. This woman is looking towards us as if she's on stage and we're in the audience. But what if she does this? In the earliest movies, people seldom turned their backs to the camera like this. This film, made in 1908, was one of the first in which this was done. But if directors were to give actors the freedom to turn their backs to the camera like this, then it occurred to them they could point the camera in the opposite direction to see what would eventually be called the reverse angle shot. Directors were putting their cameras into the action, freeing themselves to film from any angle. This new freedom was an exhilarating break with theatre and seemed entirely natural to cinema, central to it. So, in the 60s in France, when Jean-Luc Godard refused to bring his camera round to show the face of Anna Karenina at the start of Vive sa vie, the effect was shocking.